Today, we're discussing the Evergrande crisis in China and what it means to Canadians from two perspectives. First of all, what it means to the Canadian economy, and second of all, the lessons that you as a Canadian borrower should be taking from this very, very, very large company's default. But before we get into it, do me that favor, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and please hit that like button so more people like you can see this video. And don't forget about our race to 25,000 subscribers, where one lucky subscriber is going to win $5,000 just for subscribing to this channel. But in order to win, you have to be subscribed, so go ahead, do it. It's free, it's easy, and it's definitely worth it. The definitive guide on how to manage your credit, product, penalty, price, in that order. It's never been more important to get your mortgage right. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's discuss the Evergrande crisis and let's discuss what it means to you, both from an economy perspective and the lessons that you should be taking as a borrower. And let's start first and foremost with what Evergrande is. This is a very, very, very large Chinese company that does most of the real estate development in that country. It is probably the single largest indebted company in the world. To put it in perspective, they have about $300 billion in debt. To put that in real perspective, Russia has about $257 billion in debt. So they carry a larger debt load than some of the biggest countries in the world. And what that means and what is happening is that when things change in the economy and you're no longer able to pay your debts, you in theory default. And when you default, that has big repercussions, especially when you are a company that is, from a debt perspective, as big as many countries. So here's what's happening. And the long and short of it is this. You've got a company in China. The real estate market changed and the rules around borrowing changed so that they were no longer able to borrow to cover the payments on their debts. This is something that the Chinese government did about a year ago. And as a result, what has happened is you have this company that now has an $80 million payment and then another $50 million payment that are coming due on their bonds. And basically what has happened is that you've got this $80 million and this $50 million coming due. And you've got what would normally be a really good month, September, in China for real estate, not performing in the way that it was expected. In fact, they're selling significantly less houses than previously expected. And in their cases, they're condos, apartments, and big, big, big complexes. And as a result, that has led Evergrande to not be able to make its $50 and $80 million payments. And ultimately, when you default on debt, company goes into foreclosure, or goes into bankruptcy. If you're a person, it goes into foreclosure. And as a result, you end up in this scenario where all the people, the 220,000 people that rely on Evergrande as a major source of jobs in the economy, you've got other countries that rely on Evergrande in order to import their goods. And basically, you've got this worldwide effect that's happening as a result of one entity. And that is basically the long and short of what's happening. Can't make their payments, and as a result, a lot of people in China and a lot of other countries could have a trickle-down effect that is similar to what happened in 2008 with Lehman Brothers in the US when they weren't able to make their debts. Now, here's the big difference, is Lehman Brothers in 2008 was a lesson to pretty much every country, every government out there, and every company out there. And in a scenario where none of the other big banks in the US were willing to support Lehman and the government was willing to support Lehman, what ended up happening was you had this worldwide financial crash, and that worldwide financial crash led to what was basically the financial crisis. And in this scenario, I think it is unlikely that China isn't going to support Evergrande out of fear that it could lead to that same sort of scenario. Now, here's the thing. Here's what the lesson is for borrowers before we get into what this means for the economy. The lesson for borrowers in Canada is this. What is happening to Evergrande where they aren't able to pay their bills because of shifts in the economy and shifts in rules, those are things that can happen to you as well as an individual borrower. We've seen this in the past. The government is ready and willing to make changes to lending rules at the drop of a hat. This is what is causing Evergrande all the trouble. The Chinese government changed their lending rules, and it can happen to Canadians in the exact same way. So what you have to be really conscious of when you are borrowing is that you don't find yourself in a situation where you have a lot of debt and the inability to make the payments should something change in your job or the rules or the finances or the economy and so on and so forth. That's why in my book, The Mortgage Millionaire, I talk about how paying off your mortgage first can sentence you to a lifetime of debt. And the reason for that is quite simple, that people who take all of their money and fire it into their debt end up in a situation where they become house rich, cash poor, and then potentially end up defaulting when something changes in the economy. This is something that I've learned from experience. My wife and I found ourselves in that exact same position where we increased our payments, tried to pay off our mortgage without saving first. And as a result, we ended up having to go to my parents and borrow money in order to make sure we could make our mortgage payments, even though we had a ton of equity built up in our property. Now, the key lesson there was that we weren't able to borrow that equity because we had chosen a 5-year fixed mortgage with a big bank and ended up with a $25,000 penalty, which prevented us from being able to access the money that we had plowed into our mortgage. So I firmly believe that people should always have savings, a rainy day fund, and they should have that prior to getting aggressive about paying off their debt. That's why I've decided to give away the Mortgage Millionaire for free. You can go to mortgagemillionaire.ca. You can get this book completely for free. All you have to do is pay shipping and handling. And I think that the lessons in this book are really, really important, especially given what's going on with Evergrande. Because if we jump in and we take a look at the news here, Kelly McFarland is saying Canada has an Evergrande economy. And basically what she's saying here is that the debt levels that the government is running up are pretty similar to the debt levels that a company like Evergrande has run up. And that therefore is going to be a problem if the debts ever come due and something changes. And to that extent, the same way that this has happened with the federal government, we see this happening with individuals where they're running up more and more debt that they can't necessarily afford. The amount of times we get questions about being able to stretch how much somebody can afford on a weekly basis is growing faster and faster and faster. And the problem with that is that when somebody's asking us to stretch out how much they can afford, what they're really asking us to do is give them a bigger payment that they can afford, which would eventually lead to a default scenario like that of what's happening with Evergrande. Now, here's the next step. The next step is, what does this mean to the Canadian economy? Because what it looks like there's going to be a bailout here, and it looks like the Chinese government and another Chinese firm are going to intervene. They're going to purchase the shares of Evergrande, at least 51% of it, and that is going to save the company from collapse. So there's not a big Lehman Brothers style crisis that is looming as a result of this. We've learned our lesson on that, but with what's happening in the Chinese real estate market, with there being more houses available and less buyers to buy them, what that means is that there's going to be less demand for things like lumber, things like steel, things like oil, things like all of the things that Canadians provide. And when you look at the amount that we export to China and how much we import from China, if the Chinese economy catches a cold, then guess what? So does the Canadian economy. And it used to be when the American economy catches a cold, so too does the Canadian economy. But what is now happening and what we're realizing with respect to the Evergrande crisis is that it is now true for that country far across the Pacific, and we need to be cognizant of that. Now, what does that mean for interest rates? Because here's the thing, is if we are seeing less exports and we're seeing less growth in our economy due to what's going on in China, guess what that means? It means more time at lower interest rates, means less demand for our goods, which means lower prices. We could end up in a deflationary period in 2022. We've talked about that previously. We've talked about the fact that it's a possibility. We'll see what happens when the baseline effects wear off on the inflation numbers. But for the most part, what we're seeing is we're seeing a very significant chance that what's going on in China could trickle down through other economies, and we could be seeing low growth and low interest rates for a long time to come, just like we expected based on the data that we had from the early 20s in North America and what's happened in Japan since 1995, where they have essentially stayed at ridiculously low interest rates for a very long time. So, while inflation seems to be here, and while interest rates going up seems to be the common theme, don't necessarily bank on the fact that that is going to happen, and be comfortable in the fact that if you're getting a variable rate right now, you are saving a significant amount of money, and that you probably shouldn't be locking in that rate until such time as interest rates do start to go up and you start to see a position where you could lose on that variable rate. Now, if you're absolutely not comfortable with variable rates and you want to be safe and secure, by all means, I totally understand people's desire to have a fixed rate mortgage. But if you're interested in saving and saving a significant amount of money, variable is where it's at. And there is a good chance that things that happen outside of our economy could have a downward pressure on interest rates for the long term to come. So if you found this video useful, do me that favor, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, please hit that like button so more people like you can see this video. Don't forget about our race to 25,000 subscribers, and we'll see you on the very next one. Cheers.